Hey everybody, this is a piece by Joshua Muravchik titled Intellectual Odyssey of Milovan Djilas. Quote, nothing so well reveals the reality and greatness of ends as the methods used to attain them, end quote. Milovan Djilas, the new class. Milovan Djilas may be the highest-ranking official of a communist government ever willing to sacrifice his position and his well-being purely for reasons of philosophical rejection of the system of which he was a part. At the time of Djilas' split, he was vice president of Yugoslavia, president of the National Assembly, a member of the six-man secretariat of the Executive Committee of the League of Communists, and universally regarded as the third highest official in Yugoslavia, beneath only Tito and Edvard Kardelj. Again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that name right. There have been others like Djilas, former Castro lieutenant Hubert Matos, for example, who spent 20 years in a Cuban jail, but not many. It's probably Uber Matos. I don't know if you say it. It says Hubert Matos. But Uber Matos Benitez lived from 1918 to 2014, was a Cuban military leader, political dissident, activist, and writer. Uber Benitez opposed the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista from its inception in 1952 and fought alongside Fidel Castro, Raúl Castro, Che Guevara, Camilo Cienfuegos, and other members of the 26th of July movement to overthrow the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. Following the success of the Cuban Revolution that brought Fidel Castro to power, Uber Matos criticized the regime's shift in favor of Marxist principles and ties to the Popular Socialist Party, PSP. Convicted of treason and sedition by the revolutionary government, Uber Matos spent 20 years in prison, 1959 to 1979, before being released in 1979. Uber Matos then divided his time between Miami, Florida, and Costa Rica while continuing to protest the policies of the Cuban government. Back to the text. There have been numerous other ideological splits within ruling communist parties, but like that between Stalin and Trotsky, they almost always intermixed ideological struggles with power struggles, making it uncertain whether the ideas advanced were actually believed in anyone or were merely concocted for tactical reasons. Djilas, in contrast, engaged in no power struggle. True, Djilas published his dissident ideas for the brief period that he was able to, with the hope that people would rally to them, but he did not try to organize a faction or any other kind of support for his views, much less for any personal advancement based on them. Djilas was not a man innocent of the dynamics of power. Djilas achieved his position of leadership in the Yugoslav Communist Party during the Yugoslav Communist Party's long, bitter struggle for control over the government. Milovan Djilas did not organize support for his position because his split with Tito and his other old comrades was not a grab for power, but was simply a matter of belief. Djilas knew that the unorthodox views he began to air in 1953 would almost surely lead him to trouble, and he is apparently one of those men who was possessed by Polonius's dictum, quote, to thine own self be true, end quote. One of Djilas's novels, Montenegro, one of the heroes goes to the gallows rather than recant. Explaining his deliberate sacrifice of his own life, the hero says, quote, I shall remain clean in my own eyes and before the laws of my own personality, by my own categorical imperative, end quote. Djilas expressed the same idea in his own voice when he wrote in The Unperfect Society about his apostasy, quote, better Trotsky's fate than Stalin's, end quote. Better to lose the battle true to one's ideals than to win it in their corruption. Sorry, I was just seeing these footnotes go anywhere. No. But I did want to look up some things up from that last paragraph. Polonius. Polonius is a character in William Shakespeare's play Hamlet. Polonius is the chief counselor of the play's ultimate villain, Claudius, and the father of Laertes and Ophelia. Generally regarded as wrong in every judgment he makes over the course of the play, Polonius is described by William Hazlitt as a, quote, sincere father, but also a, quote, busybody who is accordingly officious, garrulous, and impertinent, unquote. In Act 2, Hamlet refers to Polonius as, quote, tedious old fool, end quote, and haunts him as a latter-day Jephthah. I don't know what that means. Polonius connives with Claudius to spy on Hamlet. Hamlet unknowingly kills Polonius, provoking Ophelia's descent into madness, ultimately resulting in her probable suicide, and the climax of the play, a duel between Laertes and Hamlet. I want to see if I can look up any of these books. Djilas, Montenegro. The description for this book says, following his expulsion from the top rank of the Yugoslav communist government, Milovan Djilas was imprisoned from 1956 to 1961. This is one of 3 books he wrote in prison. It is a remarkable story, being part history and part fiction, a blend of reality and legend, the ballad-like tone of Montenegro, with its deep and clear awareness that violence both destroys and heightens life, resembles Land Without Justice, the autobiography of Djilas' early years. What was the other book? Unperfect Society. Unperfect Society, Beyond the New Class by Milovan Djilas. It was published at least in English in 1969, and the description says, the importance of Milovan Djilas' reflections on communism is heightened not only by the personal suffering he has undergone to make them known during some 9 years as a political prisoner in Yugoslavia, but also by his dramatic experience as an administrator in that communist state. In The Unperfect Society, Djilas goes beyond the disillusionment of his earlier book, The New Class, and examines the origins and claims of communist ideology. Milovan Djilas finds that communism, like all utopianisms, became dangerous because it confuses aims with means, ideas with realities, mankind with men. He also declares that although some communist societies will persist, communist ideology is in a state of disintegration and is no longer acceptable, even to communist leaders, as a means of social organization. Djilas delivered the manuscript of The Unperfect Society when he visited the United States in the fall of 1968. Back to the text. More important than the fact of Djilas' heresy is the intellectual odyssey on which it carried him. This odyssey constitutes an important contribution to the understanding of one of the major questions of the 20th century. Why does communism, which wins the allegiance of millions through the promise of a better world, brutally and totally betray that promise? Djilas was one communist who believed in the promise wholeheartedly. Quote, it is a great honor, end quote. He wrote in 1942, quote, to live in the era of Stalin, end quote. That's from Djilas in Parts of a Lifetime, edited by Michael and Deborah Milinkovich. Let's see if I can find a description of that book. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything good, like any good descriptions for it. Anyway, end footnote. And his disillusionment impelled Djilas to examine its betrayal with a rare intensity. Djilas had killed for his beliefs, and members of his family had been killed for those beliefs. The realization that they constituted a false god infused Djilas with a burning desire to explain why. In understanding Djilas' disillusionment, it is necessary first to know something of how he came to be a communist. Quote, "It was classical and humanistic literature," end quote. Djilas said, quote, "that threw me to communism. True, it did not lead directly to communism, but taught more humane and just relations among men." End quote. Djilas, Land Without Justice. The description here on Google Books says, this is the first part. Land Without Justice is the first part of the autobiography of Milovan Djilas, who rose to become one of the leaders of international communism. It is also the story of his native land, Montenegro. For Djilas writes, quote, "The story of a family may be the portrait in miniature of a land," end quote. Djilas' first memories were of heroism and of violence. The soil of his Montenegrin village was nourished by blood. In him is reflected his kinsman, a fiery, independent people, dark with misery, yet at the same time healed by visions of beauty. The Montenegrins come vividly to life in Djilas' intense account, written in simple lyrical prose that does not betray the dramatic circumstances in which the book was written. During the period just before the author's imprisonment for his criticisms of the Communist Party, he helped to bring to power. Back to the text. The yearning for more humane and just relations came naturally enough to Djilas as a young boy growing up in the mountainous lands of Montenegro. Quote, "The rebellion of the hungry mountains against the rich valley has been going on in this country for several generations," end quote, said Djilas. And that quote is from Memoir of a Revolutionary. The description says, quote, "Now I felt that the world was so clear to me that I would be able to influence its destiny," end quote. That is the spirit of the 1930s, the period Milovan Djilas describes in Memoir of a Revolutionary. Djilas became a communist when the communist movement in Yugoslavia was growing into the force that eventually gave form to modern Yugoslavia. Determined and heroically hard-headed, Djilas suffered brutalities at the hands of King Alexander's police. Undeterred, Djilas continued to organize, write, publish, learn. For a while, Djilas tried to combine his literary ambitions with his political ideals, but Djilas soon realized that his, quote, "poetic passion" was in conflict with his revolutionary discipline. There is iron determination in this man who became, under Tito's leadership, a chief architect of the communist revolution. The Yugoslav communists built an organization strong enough to both resist Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Russia. A tightly knit group personally and politically, they enforced a personal morality that drove some dedicated men to despair. Djilas helped to mild minds. Others organized cadres. With Tito, Djilas maintained a special, quote, "father and son relationship," end quote. With most perfect recall, Djilas tells of these years of struggle and triumph, of the time spent in prison, which was, he says, quote, "perhaps the most important school, for our spiritual transformation," end quote. This book is a rare study of human commitment. Back to the text. Perhaps as a result, even today, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia is embarrassed by the large overproportion of Montenegrins in its hierarchy. Footnote: Richard F. Starr, Communist Regimes in Eastern Europe. Not seeing any good descriptions for that book. End footnote. The yearning for a better life, for a different way of life, was animated in Djilas by his acute sense of the pathos endemic to the culture in which he was raised. Djilas explains, quote, "My family, is typical in one respect. The men of several generations have died at the hands of Montenegrins, men of the same faith and name. My father's grandfather, my own two grandfathers, my father and my uncle were killed as though a dread curse lay upon them. My father and his brother and my brothers were killed, even though all of them yearned to die peacefully in their beds beside their wives." End quote. Djilas. Djilas reports that he became a communist at the age of 8. Not that he knew what communism was, nor even what he knew any real communists, but he knew the word. It meant to him the urgent desire for something different. As he grew older, his communist faith crystallized in stages. Djilas was in the 8th grade when the fledgling Yugoslav democracy was overthrown. Quote, "The dictatorship of January 6 suppressed all political and intellectual activity. It was an exceptional event in my life as well." End quote. Djilas reports. Let's see. Wikipedia says, the 6th of January dictatorship was a royal dictatorship established in the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, Kingdom of Yugoslavia after 1929, by King Alexander I, with the ultimate goal to create a Yugoslav ideology and a single Yugoslav nation. It began on the 6th of January 1929 when the king prorogued, I don't know what that means, Parliament, and assumed control of the state, and ended with the 1931 Yugoslav Constitution. Back to the text. Djilas' radicalism came to flower not atypically when he left home to attend the university in Belgrade in 1929. The following years were a time of ferment. Quote, "The circumstances gave rise to a generation of revolutionaries among the intellectual students," end quote, Djilas writes. In 1933, Djilas, then 22 years old, was arrested and tortured for his radical activity. Djilas spent 3 years in prison, years that made a real communist of him. Quote, "Prison prepared us for one way, the communist way," end quote, Djilas writes. The communism embraced by his prison-hardened young revolutionary constituted a very unitary, absolute, and messianic worldview. Human suffering and unhappiness were the result of social injustice. Social injustice was the result of capitalism. Socialism would abolish injustice, suffering, and unhappiness. The worldwide triumph of socialism had begun already in Russia. Russia embodied the hope of the future. The communist parties all over the world, which were under the leadership of Russia, were history's appointed agents for the transformation of the world, from capitalism to socialism. It was this great clarity of vision, together with genuine literary ability, that qualified Djilas as the party's chief propagandist. It was also this clarity of vision that made it possible for Djilas to kill for communism and otherwise to sublimate his humanitarian impulses. Djilas explains that in the 1930s he had not known the truth about Stalin's purges, Parenthesis, one imagines that Djilas today would agree that he didn't know because he didn't want to know, end parenthesis. And then Djilas goes on to explain a cardinal feature of communist belief, quote, I cannot rightly tell even today what I would have done had I known the truth about the trials and purges. I can say with certainty that my conscience would have undergone a serious crisis, but it is not excluded that I would have continued to be a communist, convinced of a communism that was more ideal than the one that existed. For with communism as an idea, the essential thing is not what is being done, but why, end quote. Footnote, Djilas, Conversations with Stalin. Let's see if there's any good descriptions of Conversations with Stalin. Oh, there's a Wikipedia page. Conversations with Stalin is a historical memoir by Yugoslav communist and intellectual Milovan Djilas. The book is an account of Djilas' experiences of several diplomatic trips to Soviet Russia as a representative of the Yugoslav communists. Writing in hindsight, Djilas recounts how his initial enthusiasms and feelings of ideological and ethnic brotherhood towards the Russian communists were replaced by feelings of bitterness and disappointment following his repeated confrontations with the brutal, despotic reality of the Soviet regime under Joseph Stalin. Other figures which appear in the memoir include Josip Broz Tito, Alexander Rankovic, Edvard Kardel of Yugoslavia, Vyacheslav Molotov, Ivan Stepanovich Konev, and Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union, and Georgy Dimitrov of Bulgaria. Back to the text. End footnote. But this monolithic quality of Djilas' worldview also made it very fragile. When experience called into question one tenet, the whole structure began to crumble. Each time this happened, Djilas felt compelled to repair the system with such theoretical modifications as would make it whole again. That for Djilas was the most important thing, to have a worldview in which all the pieces held together. That is what, at first, communism provided for Djilas. But Djilas was a man of great intellectual courage and integrity. When experience failed to sustain his communist beliefs, he split with communism. Djilas later revised his views frequently to accommodate new experiences, but also in pursuit of a new organic whole, the correct theory that would explain all, the true ideology. Not only did new experiences demand theoretical adjustments, but every new answer seemed inexorably to present new questions. If Soviet communism is false, how can Yugoslav communism be true? If Soviet and Yugoslav communism are both false, how can communism as an ideal be true? If communism as an ideal is false, how can Marxism be true? This, then, was the unfolding of Djilas' heresy. It had four main stages. First, when the Soviet communists, as Djilas saw it, turned on the Yugoslavs, Djilas developed the theory that Russian, but not Yugoslav, communism was corrupted with bureaucratism. This was Djilas' break with Stalin. Then, in the early 1950s, Djilas, still in a high position, began to observe that Yugoslav reality was also failing to fulfill the communist ideal, so he launched a campaign against Yugoslav, quote, bureaucratism. This was his break with Tito. It resulted in Djilas' disgrace and loss of position in early 1954. The experience led Djilas to the conclusion that bureaucratism is not a mere tendency in communism, but is the very essence of communism, a view which he presented in 1957 in his most celebrated work, The New Class, a view which constituted his break with Lenin. Yet, though The New Class, a Marxist attack on Leninism, brought Djilas world fame, Djilas was not satisfied with the theory it embodied. Clearly, Lenin introduced an elitism alien to the pure Marxian spirit. But can Lenin be dismissed as nothing more than a false Marxist? And if so, what is it about Marxism that leads only its false variants to triumph? Either way, the roots of the problem are to be found in Marxism itself, hence the final stage of Gillas's Odyssey, the break with Marx. But where in Marx is the noxious kernel to be found? Not so much in the substance as in the very assertion of ideology, the attempt to construct one all-embracing worldview. This is the somewhat ironic conclusion of Gillas's Odyssey. Disillusioned with the ideology of communism, Djilas then pursued various ideological explanations of communism until he reached the conclusion that ideology itself was the problem. If in ideology man seeks political answers to questions that are perhaps more spiritual than political, Djilas says, quote, ideologies are closed systems of thought and action, products of modern times, resulting mostly from the failures and irrelevance of religion in solving modern social and human problems, end quote. Djilas. It's from an article, New York Times, 23rd of March, 1969. The former Stalinist, former Titoist, former Leninist, former Marxist ends up holding to, quote, existential humanism, end quote, by which is meant the belief in freedom, a measure of social security, and the understanding that no single theory adequately captures the full complexity of human life. New section. The break with Stalin. The earliest fissure in the solid wall of Djilas's absolute commitment to the absolute dogma of Stalinist Marxist-Leninism appeared during the war. The first grew out of discontent with Stalin's insufficiency of revolutionary zeal, at least with respect to Yugoslavia. The Yugoslav communists adopted the policy of fighting the foreign enemy and the civil war simultaneously. Their goal was to participate with others in liberating Yugoslavia from the Axis invaders and at the same time to consolidate their power within the country so that they would emerge as its rulers when the invaders were driven off. Stalin, while supporting the Yugoslav communists, was much more interested in the war against the Germans than the war against the Yugoslav non-communists. It was, after all, Germans, not Yugoslav monarchists, who had occupied Stalingrad, and Stalin had a pretty clear notion that by beating the Germans he was going to bring communism to Eastern Europe with or without domestic revolutions. Stalin's paramount concern with respect to the Yugoslav revolution was that the activities of Tito and Tito's comrades might antagonize or alarm the British, and thus jeopardize either their wartime cooperation or their post-war acquiescence. Thus, the Yugoslav communists found that their revolutionary undertakings were greeted with ambivalence by the very authority whose approval they most ardently hoped to receive. Djilas wrote, quote, though nobody, not even the Yugoslav communists, spoke of revolution, it was long since obvious that it was going on. In the West, they were already writing a great deal about it. In Moscow, however, they obdurately refused to recognize it, end quote. Djilas, Conversations with Stalin. In time, the Russians assigned a permanent military mission to Tito's partisan headquarters, but only 9 months after the British had done so. The Russian mission was headed by General Korneyev, whose behavior proved another source of disappointment to the starry-eyed Yugoslav communists. I'm going to look up General Korneyev. There's an AI overview, but I'm seeing if there's anything. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything. In time, the Russians assigned a permanent military mission to Tito's partisans' headquarters, but only 9 months after the British had done so. The Russian mission was headed by a General Korneyev, whose behavior proved another source of disappointment to the starry-eyed Yugoslav communists. The fact that this Red Army general came accompanied by an orderly was not in itself too hard for the Yugoslav comrades to accept, but the general's persistent public abuse of his orderly didn't square well with communist principles as Djilas understood them. Quote, "The idealization of these new Soviet men began to wane," end quote, Djilas wrote. It's from footnote. Djilas, Wartime, translated by Michael Petrovich. The description just says an account of the partisan campaign in Yugoslavia during World War II, written from the author's unique perspective as a key leader of Tito's forces. End footnote. The impact of General Korneyev's behavior was only a faint adumbration of things to come. The year 1945 brought victory to the Yugoslav communists. It also brought the Red Army into Yugoslavia. No sooner had the partisans entered Belgrade and had Djilas, as a top official of the provisional government, found himself in office, than reports about the misbehavior of the Red Army began to reach him. He writes, quote, "I was overwhelmed by detailed accounts of the violent behavior of Soviet soldiers, their grabbing of revolvers and watches from our officers, and their looting and raping. ... Late that night, long after I laid down to sleep, these violent scenes and distorted views of Soviet men kept me from falling asleep. Everything that was worth admiring and remembering ... receded before our anguish and doubts that the Red Army was not all that we had imagined, not all that it should be," end quote. Djilas. And there's a Wikipedia for rape during the liberation of Serbia. It says in late 1944 and early 1945, rapes were committed against women by the Soviet Red Army soldiers during their advance to Berlin through Serbia during the Second World War. This behavior was not merely, back to the text, this behavior was not merely obnoxious in itself, it also posed to the orthodox communist Marxists the most bedeviling theoretical questions. This was, after all, 28 years after the Bolshevik Revolution. The bulk of the Red Army, thus, were men who were born and raised under, quote, socialism. They were the world's finest example of the, quote, new man, which socialism was destined to produce. It was impossible to separate one's impressions about the Soviet soldiers from one's thoughts about Soviet society as a whole. Quote, illusions about the Red Army, and consequently the communists themselves, were being destroyed, end quote, writes Djilas. Djilas's protests to General Korneyev about these incidents were less restrained than those of other Yugoslav leaders. He provoked Korneyev's wrath, and through him Stalin's as well. Shortly thereafter, Tito included Djilas in a delegation to the Soviet Union in the hope of repairing the rift between Djilas and Russians. In this, his second visit to the Soviet Union, Djilas began to see some things in a more critical light than he had on his first visit, which had left him in a state of, quote, rapture. It seems not surprising that with the anomalies that most struck Djilas at this early stage had to do with relations among states or nationalities. Visiting the Ukraine, Djilas found himself wondering, quote, Whence this nationalism if the peoples of the USSR are really equal? We were bewildered and astonished at the marked Russification of public life. End quote. Djilas. Conversations with Stalin. Also disturbing was the fact that Dimitrov, the Bulgarian General Secretary of the Comintern, who had been living for years in refuge in Russia, was being prevented by Stalin from returning to Bulgaria once it was safe to do so. Djilas described the effect these observations had on him in a statement that also reveals a lot about himself. Quote, in politics, more than in anything else, the beginning of everything lies in moral indignation and in doubt of the good intentions of others. End quote. Djilas. That's from Conversations with Stalin as well. One can only speculate about how far alienated from Soviet communism Djilas might have grown as a result merely of such moral indignation. Within a few years, the rift between the Soviet and Yugoslav rulers grew, resulting in Yugoslavia's expulsion from the Cominform in 1948. This transformed Djilas' attitude towards Stalin and his cohorts from a mere sense of unease to a stance of out-and-out opposition. Just real quick, the Cominform, according to Wikipedia, the Information Bureau of the Communist and Workers' Parties, commonly known as Cominform, was a coordinated body of Marxist-Leninist communist parties in Europe, which existed from 1947 to 1956, formed in the wake of the dissolution of the Communist International in 1943. It did not replace that body, but instead mainly served as an expression of solidarity and as a means of disseminating Stalinist propaganda. The Cominform initially included the communist parties of the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Yugoslavia (expelled in 1948), France, and Italy. The organization was dissolved in 1956 during de-Stalinization. Back to the text. This transformed Djilas' attitude towards Stalin and his cohorts from a mere sense of unease to a stand of out-and-out opposition. Perhaps even more important than the plain hostility that the split engendered were the theoretical questions it posed, which demanded answers of any Marxist who took his ideology seriously. Fred Warner Neal posed the problem this way. I'm going to look up who Fred Warner Neal is. Fred Warner Neal. Looks like he's written some books on Yugoslavia that are probably out of print or sitting on library shelves. Campuses across the country not being touched for 40 years. Anyway, Fred Warner Neal posed the problem this way. Quote, the Yugoslav communists were convinced that they were good communists, as loyal as ever to the cause for which they had sacrificed mightily. Yet all other communists in the world were denouncing them for not being good communists. What had happened? The Yugoslavs reasoned that since they were still good communists, and the Soviet Union was opposing them, it was the Soviet Union that was really the heretic. Stalin wanted to dominate Yugoslavia and exploit Yugoslavia for the benefit of the USSR, but a socialist country does not, by definition, dominate and exploit other nations. That is what capitalist countries do. Could it be that the USSR was not truly a socialist country? End quote. Fred Warner Neal, from an article, Titoist Theory and Titoist Practice, published in Journal of International Affairs. As the Yugoslav Party's chief publicist and propagandist, Djilas took the lead in addressing this question. Djilas was at pains to make 2 points. First, Marxists know that all international conflicts result from contradictions within society. The Soviet-Yugoslav conflict reflected something wrong with the Soviet social system. Second, the Yugoslav social system was basically different from the Soviet system, even though the bourgeois world tended to lump all communist states together. Djilas said, quote, ... The aggressive policy of subjugating other people's quote quote the aggressive policy of subjecting other peoples derives in fact precisely from the international relations existing at present in the Soviet Union. This conflict with the Soviet Union revealed to us Yugoslavs the nature of the internal order prevailing in the Soviet Union, from which the internal order in Yugoslavia differs both in origin and in development, regardless of all superficial and outward similarities. It is from this internal development of the Soviet Union, which includes the domination of the bureaucracy over the national economy, in other words, over the people directly engaged in production, over the nation itself, that the foreign policy of the Soviet government also issues. The internal relations in Yugoslavia and those in the Soviet Union. Is precisely in this difference that we find the very core of the Soviet Yugoslav conflict. End quote. Footnote: Djilas, Yugoslav-Soviet Relations, published in International Affairs, April 1951. That, however, was only the beginning of the problem. 3 things were clear enough: that the Russians weren't genuine socialists, that the Yugoslavs were, and that their conflict with each other grew out of this contradiction. What was not at all clear was the nature of Soviet society if the Soviet society was not socialist. This question is absolutely critical for any Marxist. Marx formulated the, quote, scientific laws that govern the development of societies. These form the center of Marxist theory, without which the whole edifice crumbles. The ordinary course of development of societies was from feudalism to capitalism to socialism. Marxists can allow for deviations from this classical pattern in certain countries, as Marx himself did, but any such deviation requires thorough explanation. The theoretical question in this instance was about as difficult as can be imagined. What kind of exploitative social system could arise following a socialist revolution? This question, it is worth noting, does not arise for Menshevik or Social Democrats, even if orthodox Marxists. For them, the Bolshevik seizure of power was not a socialist revolution. The Yugoslav communists, however, never questioned the socialist bona fides of the Bolshevik takeover, nor could they without questioning the legitimacy of the entire communist world, including themselves. End parenthesis. It is clear that Djilas must have wrestled with this question. Early in 1950, he described the Soviet Union as a society in which a privileged bureaucracy perverted socialism and exploited people. Djilas added that in a world still dominated by capitalism, socialist exploitation could not differ much from capitalist exploitation. Later that year, it was reported he described the Soviet Union as having become a fascist state. Indeed, that's what C.L.R. James called it. In 1951, Djilas described Soviet society to a French magazine as a, quote, restoration and counter-revolution of a special type, end quote. Djilas, New York Times, 1950. In 1952, Djilas described the Soviet Union as, quote, state capitalistic, end quote. That's from New York Times, 1952. One of the above quotes is from a book titled Political Themes in the Thought of Milovan Djilas, unpublished doctoral dissertation, by a J.W. McDonald. So, Djilas is saying that the USSR is state capitalistic. I don't know if that necessarily means it's state capitalist, but it's like resembling some kind of state capitalism, you know. When someone says something is capitalistic, they're not saying it is capitalism, but it bears similarities. So I don't know what that means for Djilas. For the purpose merely of polemicizing against the Soviets, it may have been adequate to describe their system as, quote, a restoration, on one day, is, quote, fascism on another, and is, quote, state capitalism on a third. But for theoretical purposes, this will hardly do. Even a critical observer of Djilas would have to agree that he is very sincere about his Marxism. Djilas's inner need to find an intellectually satisfying answer to this question was one of the important forces impelling him along the road to apostasy. Early in the period between Yugoslavia's expulsion from the Common Forum in 1948 and Djilas's split with his comrades in 1953-54, Djilas toyed with the idea that the Soviet rulers might constitute a new class. But Djilas rejected that idea for two reasons. First, the bureaucracy, quote, does not own the means of production in the traditional sense, end quote, and second, quote, it does not reproduce itself, end quote. The bureaucrat, quote, cannot pass his position on to his progeny, end quote. Djilas, 1952. The reason for Djilas's early rejection of the idea of a new class may seem somewhat obtruse to the non-Marxist, but this theoretical judgment was to have very important consequences. Quote, bureaucratism is an inevitable danger of the transitional period, end quote, Djilas concluded. Quote, but since the bureaucracy is not a class, but a reactionary anti-socialist tendency that appears in the transition from capitalism to communism, the struggle against bureaucracy is revolutionary and progressive, end quote. Djilas, 1952. Armed with this theoretical understanding, Djilas set about to wage the struggle against bureaucratism in Yugoslavia. New section. The break with Tito. Quote, with the victory over Stalin, end quote, Djilas was later to write, quote, Tito was elated, but Tito had already begun to calm down, fearing that the undammed streams might overflow the channels Tito had built for them, end quote. Djilas, unperfect. What's the word? What was that? The unperfect society? Yeah, the unperfect society. Djilas himself was impelled in a different direction. Quote, I participated in the anti-common form campaign. Was that an actual... That's just a general... No, I'm not seeing anything for that. So it just might be not a formal organization. Quote, or a campaign. Quote, I participated in the anti-common form campaign. Thereafter, I started applying some of those criticisms to events in Yugoslavia, end quote, he said. In so doing, he discovered that, quote, the same objective bureaucratic tendencies are found and will continue to be found for a long time in our own reality, end quote. Djilas, 1952. For a time, the diverging instincts of these two men coexisted peacefully. Tito was willing to permit a degree of disagreement. And Djilas's views constituted a force for liberalism within the government and party. Djilas used the party newspaper Borba as a forum to propound such, quote, anti-bureaucratic ideas as these, quote, ... The transformation of the village to socialism must be brought about voluntarily by the working peasantry, ... Administrative measures will only cause damage and delay in this process. End quote. Djilas, 1948. Quote, the administrative apparatus in socialism cannot possess an ideological monopoly without at the same time violating the principles of socialist democracy, We should educate a free socialist man, who is broad-minded and not one whose mind is forced into a rigid mold, end quote. Djilas, 1950. The fact that Djilas' views at the time he ranked third in the state and party hierarchy were not identical to Tito's was perceptible on occasion even to the outside. Thus, in March 1952, the New York Times reported on an article in Borba in which Djilas said that a planned party purge must not involve police methods. It is unclear whether Djilas had any qualms about the purge itself, but he insisted that those who, quote, are unfit to be party members are not necessarily enemies of Yugoslavia and of socialism, and legal measures should be taken against them only if they violate the law of the land, end quote. Djilas, 1952. This impelled the Times correspondent to add, quote, despite M. Djilas' admonition to party organizations to refrain from strong-arm methods, it is necessary to recall here that at the end of last week, Marshal Tito, in discussing the same problem with the delegation from the National Students' Union, said Tito hoped that rough methods would not have to be used, but that there would be no hesitation about using rough methods if necessary, end quote. New York Times, 1952. Djilas' views were one influence which contributed to the liberalization of Yugoslav communism. Djilas helped to conceive the idea of, quote, worker self-management as a step toward the fulfillment of Marxist ideals. Other of Djilas' ideals were adopted under Tito's aegis at the Sixth Party Congress in November 1952, the high point of Yugoslav communist liberalism. At that meeting, the name of the party was changed to the League of Communists, and steps were taken to strengthen the future role of the, quote, People's Front, end quote. I don't know if this is what is being referred to here, but there's a thing on Wikipedia said for Socialist Alliance of Working People of Yugoslavia. The Socialist Alliance of Working People of Yugoslavia, known before 1953 as the People's Front of Yugoslavia, was the largest and most influential mass organization in SFR Yugoslavia from August 1945 through 1990. It succeeded the Unitary National Liberation Front, which gathered and politically backed anti-fascist layers of society throughout Yugoslavia since 1934. By 1990, the Socialist Alliance of Working People of Yugoslavia's membership was 13 million individuals, including most of the adult population of the country. Together with the League of Communists of Serbia, it merged in 1990 to form the Socialist Party of Serbia. Back to the text. Both of these acts were designed presumably to weaken the authority of the party, but it is doubtful that everyone foresaw as far-reaching a change as was heralded by Djilas. The New York Times reported at the Sixth Congress, quote, one communist source, bracket, almost certainly Djilas, who is quoted by name elsewhere in the same article, end bracket, pointed out that all the power had to be concentrated in the Communist Party during the struggle for power and the consolidation of power after World War II. But now that the strength of the propertied classes has been broken, there was no longer any need for this concentration. This source asserted that in the future the Communist Party would lose more and more of its authority to dictate policies in the economic and political fields, and that its power would depend on how much it could win by its own efforts from the people, end quote. New York Times, 5th of November, 1952. Contrary to Djilas' hope and expectation, the six-party Congress proved to be the climax, not the beginning of the liberalization trend. 10 months later, the party's Central Committee convened at Tito's retreat at Brioni. Tito laid down the law. The pendulum had swung too far. The time had come to reestablish party discipline. Djilas, however, was not prepared to turn back. Djilas began instead to publish in Borba what he called a, quote, series of anti-bureaucratic articles, end quote. Djilas, 1953, cited an Anatomy of a Moral, the political essays of Milovan Djilas. Edited by Abraham Rothbard. The description that's on Amazon says, Anatomy of a Moral is a non-fiction book written by Milovan Djilas, a prominent Yugoslav communist politician and writer. The book is a critical analysis of the communist ideology and its impact on the society and individual morality. Djilas examines the Marxist-Leninist theory of morality and its application in the Soviet Union and other communist states. Djilas argues that the communist ideology, with its emphasis on the collective good and the suppression of individualism, leads to the erosion of moral values and the dehumanization of the individual. Djilas also discusses the role of the Communist Party in shaping the moral and ethical standards of the society, and the dangers of the cult of personality and the concentration of power in the hands of a few. The book is a powerful critique of the communist system and a warning against the dangers of totalitarianism. Is a must-read for anyone interested in political philosophy, ethics, and the history of communism. Back to the text. End footnote. The series ran from October 1953 into January 1954 and resulted in Djilas' disgrace. Let's see if Borba has a Wikipedia. Borba was a newspaper published in former Yugoslavia and Serbia, best known from the period when it was the official gazette of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia until 1954, and Socialist Alliance of Working People of Yugoslavia thereon until its dissolution. Its name is the Serbo-Croatian word for, quote, struggle, or, quote, combat. Back to the text. Its point of departure was to liken Yugoslav bureaucratism to Soviet bureaucratism. Djilas wrote that, quote, precisely because it is, quote, socialist, or bureaucratism cannot avoid being a little Stalinist. ... It therefore stinks of the same ideological odor, end quote. In another article, he pursued this theme, quote, we built our Leninist party and later our state with our own forces, but under the influence of Lenin's ideas and Stalin's interpretation of Leninism. Much of our theory and many methods in our practice, which we considered unalloyed Marxist products, are in fact Stalin's heritage, end quote. Djilas. In these articles, Djilas began to use the term, quote, communist democrat instead of merely, quote, communist or, quote, good communist as a label of approbation. He propounded several mutually complementary themes. One of these, which speaks especially to Djilas' credit because it is a subtle idea for a revolutionary to grasp, is the importance of the rule of law. Quote, the true communist democrat, end quote, he wrote, quote, struggles for equality for all people before the law. even for the bourgeoisie, end quote. Djilas. On a closely related issue, Djilas spoke about the relationship of form and content, which is similar to the tricky, parenthesis, for communists, and parenthesis, question of means and ends. Djilas wrote, quote, in human practice, every disregard of form does not, as it might seem, arise from exaggerated eagerness and predilection for content. On the contrary, it usually results from a surreptitious intent to cheat, deceive, penetrate, and coerce the content itself, end quote. Djilas, Borba, 1953. A second key theme is that of democratism and free thought. Quote, there is no alternative but more democracy, more free discussion, more free elections, more strict adherence to law, end quote. Djilas wrote. In his next article, he added, quote, the only obstacle to despotic dangers and tendencies is democratic forms and their permanent reinforcement, as well as free thought and creative imagination, end quote. Djilas, 1953. Another important idea was Djilas' opposition to a monopoly of power and truth by the communists. Quote, every social reaction has begun and ended its life with an ideological monopoly, end quote. Djilas wrote. 1953. Quote, no one party or group, nor even a single class, can be the exclusive expression of the objective needs of contemporary society, end quote. Djilas, 1953. One other key theme, which is stressed in an article which Djilas wrote at this time in the magazine Novo Mizal, in an attack on the elitism of the bureaucracy, which it is worth emphasizing he still did not regard as a new class. Djilas referred to it variously as, quote, the caste people, and, quote, the upper caste, and a, quote, self-anointed circle which craved preeminence and exclusiveness, end quote. Djilas. I'm not sure what year. See if there's anything for Nova Misal. No, I'm not seeing anything. Where am I? Later, Djilas was to look back and say that he had a clear premonition of where this vigorous descent would lead him, and this may be so. But it also seemed that Djilas had some hope, no matter how slim, that his views would win enough support at the grassroots and within the party so that they would somehow prevail. In the last of these articles, Djilas wrote, quote, two lines of development are now possible, either transforming the revolutionary, parenthesis, therefore democratic, and parenthesis, forms into bureaucratic forms, or transforming these same forces into truly democratic ones, end quote. Djilas, 1954. 10 days later, the Central Committee stripped Djilas of all his party and government positions. Djilas intoned Tito, quote, is advocating democracy at any price, end quote. Tito. New section. Break with Lenin. Djilas' experience at the hands of the Central Committee led Djilas to rethink his views about communism. This was not necessarily egocentric. The Djilas challenge, and the party's response to the Djilas challenge, did indeed constitute a landmark in the evolution of Yugoslav communism. It established the limits of Yugoslav communist liberalism. The party's furious efforts to expunge the Djilas heresy persuaded Djilas that the Russian and Yugoslav communism had in common was no more important than their dissimilarities. That what Russian and Yugoslav communism had in common was more important than Russian and Yugoslav communism's dissimilarities. The Soviet abuses that Djilas and his comrades had often described in great detail and their post-1948 writings no longer seem to Djilas to be specific to Stalin or to Russia, but rather endemic to communism. Previously, bureaucratism had appeared to Djilas as a tendency which appeared during the transition from capitalism to communism, a tendency that could and should be resisted. Now he realized that bureaucratism was communism. Far from being a merely transitional tendency, it was the whole sum and substance. Put simply, quote, the communist revolution cannot attain a single one of the ideals named as its motivating force, end quote. Djilas. The New Class, 1957. In April 1954, Djilas resigned from the party. In December, Djilas gave an interview to the New York Times that became the basis for the first criminal proceedings against Djilas. In that interview, Djilas said, quote, I am a democratic socialist. The name communism is good, but it has been compromised. It is a synonym for totalitarianism in this country as well as in Russia, end quote. Djilas. New York Times, 1954. If no longer a communist, Djilas was still a Marxist. As a Marxist, Djilas could not be content merely to be morally opposed to communism. Djilas felt the need also to explain the theory, to put a label on the theory. The theory of communism that Djilas developed was put forward in his book, The New Class. In that presentation, Djilas' methodology and terms of reference are those of a Marxist, even while he tries to describe events that Marx had not foreseen. Communism, said Djilas, was the emergence of an entirely novel social system, neither socialist nor capitalist nor feudal. Rather, quote, communism is that type of totalitarianism that consists of three basic factors of controlling the people. First is power, the second ownership, the third ideology, end quote. All, quote, monopolized by the one and only political party, end quote. Djilas. The New Class. This new system was based on the rule of a new class, the bureaucracy, quote, a class whose power over men is the most complete known to history, end quote. Djilas, the New Class. Bureaucracies, of course, exist in every society. The, quote, new class, Djilas said, consisted not of administrative officials per se, but rather of the, quote, party and political bureaucracy, end quote. Djilas. New Class. In practice, many of the political bureaucrats were also administrative officials, but the roots of their rule lay not in their administrative positions, but in the political monopoly of the party. Seen in this light, Stalin, with all his barbarities, was not an aberration within the new class, but rather the new class's avatar. Quote, the leader who succeeds in getting to the top, end quote, said Djilas, quote, is the one who succeeds in most logically expressing and protecting the interests of the new class at any given moment, end quote. Djilas, New Class. In arguing that the bureaucracy constituted a new class, Djilas had to answer his own previous denials that it was possible for the bureaucracy to constitute anything more than a caste because it did not actually own the means of production. In the new class, Djilas set forward this explanation, quote, as in other owning classes, the proof that it is a special class lies in its ownership and its special relations to other classes. In the same way, the class to which a member belongs is indicated by the material and other privileges which ownership brings to him. As defined by Roman law, property constitutes the use, enjoyment, and disposition of material goods. The Communist Party bureaucracy uses, enjoys, and disposes of national property. ... The ownership privilege of the new class manifests itself as an exclusive right, as a party monopoly, for the political bureaucracy to distribute the national income, to set wages, direct economic development, and dispose of nationalized and other property, end quote. Djilas, the New Class. Thus, the new class was like every other ruling class in that it exercised ownership, but it was different from all other ruling classes in at least one very important way. All previous ruling classes grew to maturity within the womb of the old social order, that is, the order preceding their own. Then, once their objective weight in the social system burst the bounds of the role assigned to them in the existing order, they overthrew that order and remade society in their own image. The coming to power of a class was thus only the climax of a long ascent in its objective importance, a matter merely of the superstructure adjusting itself, so to speak, to the substructure. The rise of the new class turned this process inside out. The new class first seized power and only then set about to create a social system suited to its rule. The challenge impelled the new class to exert a particularly forced political authority. The bourgeoisie, for example, might rule over capitalist societies with a political light hand because its authority was so firmly rooted in society. But the bureaucracy had to rule communist societies with an iron hand because it had no similar, organic roots. The absence of organic roots also led the new class to make various decisions about the economy that are, economically unjustified, but that are necessary if, the new class was to be securely installed in its power, Djilas, the new class. Thus, said Djilas, communist planning, is dedicated to the development of those branches of the economy which will ensure the strengthening of the regime, Djilas, the new class. As a Marxist, Djilas was willing to grant that communist rule, even if wicked, could be in some respects historically, progressive. Djilas credited communism with having, brought about a measure of industrial civilization to vast areas of Europe and Asia, Djilas. Like all other ruling classes, the new class acted only out of self-interest. As with all other ruling classes, its self-interested actions sometimes were beneficial to society and sometimes were detrimental. An important example of the latter was collectivization of agriculture, for which Djilas could see no objective justification. The class profited from the new property it had acquired even though the nation lost thereby, Djilas wrote. The new class. Even giving communism credit for industrialization, Djilas' ultimate judgment on communist economics is hardly less condemnatory than Djilas' judgment on communist politics. Djilas wrote that, the communist economy is perhaps the most wasteful economy in the history of human society, Djilas, the new class. Then Djilas added, the greatest waste is not even visible. This is the waste of manpower, the slow, unproductive work of disinterested millions, together with the prevention of all work not considered, socialist, is the calculable, invisible, and gigantic waste which no communist regime has been able to avoid. Djilas, the new class. A description of the new class was not enough. Djilas was also eager to understand what gave rise to it. True, the new class fulfilled the historic function of industrialization, but its rise also seemed to spring from a great deal of conscious political activity. Djilas concluded that the origins of the new class were dichotomous, a conclusion he stated in terms which ought to stand as a classic effort to straddle the divide between determinism and free will. The new class came into existence for objective reasons and by the wish, wits, and actions of its leaders, Djilas. The new class. Djilas then located the source of the conscious efforts that helped to bring about the new class in Leninism. In the last days before his confrontation with the Central Committee, Djilas had confided to the New York Times correspondent in Belgrade that Djilas' views were coming, more to resemble those of the pre-Bolshevik Marxists, Djilas, New York Times, 18th of January, 1954. In The New Class, Djilas traced Marxism back to the split between communist and social democrats, or as he saw it, between East and West. Djilas concluded that both sides, were only partly right in citing him, Marx, as the basis of their own ideas, Djilas, the new class. In communism, not much was left of Marxism. Quote, only a residue of formalism and dogmatism remained of Marx's dialectics and materialism. This was used for the purpose of cementing power, justifying tyranny, and violating human consciences. End quote. Djilas, the new class. Lenin was responsible for three major features of the transition from Marxism to communism. The first was to congeal Marxism into a dogma. Quote, Marx's revolutionary ideas, which were conditional and not absolutely applicable, were changed by Lenin into absolute and universal principles, end quote, said Djilas. As a result, communists believe, quote, that they alone know the laws which govern society, end quote, and that this gives communists, quote, the exclusive right to change society and control society's activities, end quote. Djilas, the new class. Second, Lenin robbed Marxism of Marxism's democratic content by emphasizing the theory of the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, which, said Djilas, quote, inevitably evolves into the dictatorship of the leaders, end quote. Djilas. Marx had a democratic image in mind when he coined the term, but, quote, Lenin delegated the dictatorship of the proletariat to the authority of one party, his own, end quote. Djilas, the new class. Third, Lenin, by demanding and overseeing the creation of a cadre of professional revolutionaries, created the very embryo of the new class itself. Quote, that stratum of professional revolutionaries, ... made up its core even before it attained power, end quote. Said Djilas, the new class. It was not, quote, accidental, Djilas said, that Stalin, quote, was the most outstanding example of such a professional revolutionary, end quote. Djilas, the new class. Lenin was the culprit. It was Lenin who transformed Marxism from a democratic revolutionary idea into an authoritarian revolutionary praxis. It was Lenin who laid the foundations on which Lenin's logical successor, built the new class. New section, The Break with Marx. The publication of the new class in 1957 created a sensation because it was a devastating critique of communism by a former high communist official, one who still wrote as a convinced Marxist. When the new class was published, Djilas was already in jail for an article Djilas had published in the American magazine New Leader, condemning the Soviet invasion of Hungary. As a result of the new class, Djilas' term was lengthened. In 1961, Djilas was released. In 1962, Djilas was re-imprisoned for 5 more years for publishing Conversations with Stalin. During these 9 years in prison, Djilas continued to search for answers. What was it that caused the results so mercilessly to mock the maker? How was it that the pursuit of liberation and brotherhood of man ended up in slavery and untold violence? How was it that the system that was supposed to produce a, quote, new man, end quote, suffused with the finest qualities, instead thrust to the fore, quote, the greatest criminal in all history, end quote? Djilas, Conversations with Stalin. Djilas was not satisfied with putting the entire burden on Lenin. Djilas searched for deeper roots. Lenin, after all, was Marx's disciple. True, Lenin had, it was clear to Djilas, distorted some of Marx's ideas, but Djilas did not doubt that Lenin was a Marxist. It seemed hard to accept the facile dichotomy that Marxism was greatly good, while its offshoot, Leninism, was greatly bad. That would be easy for a dialectician to accept. But dialectics was the aspect of Marxism that least appealed to Djilas. Thus, it became clear to Djilas that, quote, the crisis of Stalinism is being shown to be the crisis of Marxism. It cannot be otherwise, since it is a crisis in the actual performance of the ruling Marxist parties, end quote. Djilas. New York Times, 1969. Djilas was, of course, aware of the argument that Stalin's practice was only a distortion of Marxism. Djilas believed as much himself. But Djilas' question was then, Why is this distortion the only living form that Marxism has produced? Quote, Stalin was not victorious because Stalin, quote, corrupted Marxism, but precisely because Stalin made Marxism a reality, end quote, said Djilas. And that's from, says parts. What's that abbreviation for? Parts of a Lifetime. And that's from what year? Parts of a Lifetime. I'm not sure. It's published in English in 1975. So maybe that's when. I don't know. Moreover, the link between Stalin and Marx consisted not only in Stalinist practice, but could be found on the theoretical level as well. Who, Djilas asked, could, quote, fail to notice the blood ties between Lenin and Stalin, and who could deny the relationship between Marx and Lenin, end quote. Djilas. Parts of a Lifetime. Djilas came to the opinion that, quote, the crisis is intrinsic and was present at the very birth of Marxism, end quote. Djilas. Unperfect Society. What was the nature of the crisis? It was enough to spot the roots of authoritarianism in the theories of Lenin, but not so in those of Marx. In contrast to Lenin, whose writings, reflecting the Russian revolutionary tradition, are suffused with dictatorial impulse, Marx, a product of the Enlightenment, conveys in his works the spirit of a democrat and humanist. Djilas accepts this spirit as genuine. Wherein then lay the seeds which had sprouted into Stalinism? They lay in Marx's methodology. Marx called himself a scientist, and Djilas believes Marx was a great one. But the scientist in Marx was subordinated to the prophet. Quote, Marx's ... beginnings were as a revolutionary, and it was as such that Marx sought confirmation in science for his beliefs ... Marx ... searched in the British Museum for objective laws that would justify his prophetic zeal, end quote, said Djilas. Unperfect Society. Many of the ideas Marx came up with are, to Djilas, just plainly wrong. For example, he questioned, quote, is not the communist system in itself the most extreme example of how, contrary to Marx, the juridical and political superstructure determines the relations of production? End quote. Djilas. Further, I think it's actually a very good point. And it's kind of, you see this all the time. Like one of the earmarks of capitalism that people talk about is the relative is the separation of the separation between the economic and the political under capitalism, and in a certain sense, a socialist revolution, right, would be the kind of in a certain sense, like the repoliticization of society. And then what's the matter is like, what kind of nature does that politicization take? Does it take a democratic politicization, or does it take a despotic politicization? But I think there's actually, it's like, some people might be like, oh, what a stupid thing to say, but I think there's actually a lot of merit in that comment and that question. Further, Djilas believed, quote, in the history of human thought, it would be difficult to find anything more nonsensical than the Marxist doctrine on the dialectic of nature, end quote. Again, lots of people who describe themselves as Marxists also agree with that. I think you could say that like one of the people who, a Stalinist, for instance, also critiqued that in Marxism, particularly Engels. Lukács criticized the application of dialectics to non-human entities. On the theory of alienation, Djilas wrote, quote, no mentally balanced person feels, quote, alienated simply because nature is different from him, or because he cannot control the exchange of the products made by his own hands, end quote. He continued, quote, even if he came to know that what his being and his essence were, man cannot return to them, for he has never departed from them. End quote. Djilas. Parts of a Lifetime. But far from rejecting all of Marx's work, Djilas continues to praise Marx as a great thinker and to find validity in many of Marx's ideas. And for the most part, Djilas does not find incipient tyranny even in those of Marx's ideas with which he disagrees. Nor is he willing, even after identifying the seeds of communist tyranny in Marxism, to grant that the communists are genuine Marxists. Djilas writes that, quote, by virtue of its basic humanistic qualities, the West is today incomparably closer to the classic, indeed Marxist, if you wish, socialist teaching than is the East, end quote. Djilas. The Need for a New Analysis of East-West Relations, published in 1976. What is critical for Djilas is the distinction Djilas draws between, quote, Marxian thought and, quote, Marxism. The problem, Djilas concludes, lies in the, quote, ism. Quote, Marx, has suffered the same fate as the great thinkers, end quote, says Djilas. Quote, having arrived at a truth, man's economic dependence, he turned that into the truth about man, end quote. And he adds, quote, tyranny begins with ultimate truths, end quote. Djilas. The Unperfect Society. Thus, we come to the heart of the problem, quote, ideology tends towards, quote, totalitarianism, end quote, says Djilas, and in ideology itself are to be found the seeds of Stalinism. Djilas, Parts of a Lifetime. Why is ideology so harmful? For several reasons. First, because ideology inhibits man's understanding and hence man's progress. Quote, ideologies stifle human ideals and obscure vital human problems. Mankind has survived tens of thousands of years without ideologies, though man cannot live and fight without ideals. For ideologies are closed systems of thought and action, end quote. Djilas. Second, ideology is utopian in the worst sense. It is willing, nay eager, to sacrifice today on the altar of tomorrow, to subordinate means to ends. Quote, as long as the idea of striving towards a, quote, scientific ideology, end quote, that is, towards power as an instrument for building a, quote, new society, and a, quote, new man remains active, end quote, said Djilas in 1978, then, quote, our time is still the time of Stalin, end quote. Djilas. Stalin's Legacy, published in Encounter, 1978. Marxist ideology contains a particularly treacherous element in its claim to have discovered the laws of history. Djilas asks about the communist rulers, quote, how could they think or act otherwise when they have been named by a higher power, which they call history, to establish the kingdom of heaven in this sinful world, end quote. Djilas. Unperfect Society. Quote, could it have been different in a world of absolute truths, with faith in the classless perfect society, end quote. Djilas, Parts of a Lifetime. New section. Djilas today. Having traced the roots of communist totalitarianism back to Marxism and ideology itself, Djilas solved one problem but created another. Clearly, Djilas has not abandoned, nor does he show any desire to abandon, the ceaseless, restless search for a better society and a better understanding of human life, for those strivings are constrained by the understanding that the pursuit of a better society must eschew any model of the good society, and the pursuit of better understanding must avoid any comprehensive theory of human behavior. Djilas captures this irony in the title of the latest of his theoretical books, The Unperfect Society. The title is meant to convey the rejection of absolute ideals. Not only is society not perfect, society should not even be called, quote, imperfect, because that word implies the desirability of perfection. Quote, A non-violent, peaceful society is not a possibility, but freer and more equitable societies are, end quote, said Djilas in Unperfect Society. Therefore, quote, the task for contemporary man is to accept the reality that society is unperfect, but also to understand that humanitarian dreams and visions are necessary in order to reform society, in order to improve and advance it, end quote. Djilas, Unperfect Society. In this latter formulation, Djilas reveals that in Djilas's breast still beats the heart of the ambitious reformer. In upholding the quote unperfect, Djilas is trying to expunge dogmatism, not the struggle to improve things. Thus, Djilas writes, quote, the significance of Western democracies and the extent to which Western democracies offer an ideal lies in the fact that they deny their own perfection and by doing so make it possible for themselves to embark on a process of intellectual and social criticism, end quote. Djilas, the need for a new analysis. The no longer Marxist Djilas knows that he can't avoid being asked to name or label his new views, but that is obviously an unwelcome exercise for an enemy of ideology. Djilas, quote, copes by giving himself a label that is suitably obscurant. Djilas says that he has, quote, moved toward a new, undoctrinaire, unidealized existential humanism, end quote. Djilas, Unperfect Society. Whatever that means, it is clear that Djilas believes that all ultimate aims should be eschewed. Quote, as far as Marx's new man is concerned, end quote, Djilas wrote a few years ago, quote, I'd rather follow St. Augustine, better a sinful man than an automaton, end quote. Djilas, on Alienation, published in 1971 in Encounter. And perhaps most important of all, the Djilas of today will brook no justifying of means by ends. Djilas writes, quote, the choice between one policy and another is, finally, an option for means, and means are the only reliable yardstick by which to measure the values of the ideas under whose names the means are employed, and of the leaders who employ them, end quote. Milovan Djilas, The Unperfect Society. That's the end of this piece. Thank you so much for listening.